He wrote What a River Says, Exploring the Backwater Ridge and Refuge, published by Cambridge, Maryland, Friends of Backwater in 2014. He also co-wrote Harriet Tubman's Eastern Shore, The Old Home Is Not There, published by History Press in 2021. There will be an opportunity for questions at the end of today's presentation. If you're joining us via YouTube, you can please type your questions in the chat, and if you're joining us in person, you can save your questions for the end. Thank you, and welcome, Dr. Hesser.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. It's my pleasure to be here with friends new and old, and a few friends that I've become acquainted with over the last few years that I'll be talking about in just a second. Let me first, again, introduce myself. I'm Phillip Hesser. I'm a recovering historian, meaning that I started my career in history, went into international education, and then returned for a victory lap with with Salisbury University, Warwick Community College, and also doing some detective work in the past, particularly related, as you've heard from David, to whom thanks again for the introduction, with Chesapeake Bay and the Delmarva Peninsula, looking at the intersection of life, livelihood, and landscape. Anyway, today I want to talk a little bit about an issue that actually came up when we did the launch for our book at Harriet Tubman Underground Railroad State Park and Visitor Center. After we gave brief talk, my co-author and I, about the book, we had a chance to take questions, and a question came up that was certainly dominated the Q&A session, and that was, hey, this Harriet Tubman, she was a slave. She was abused. She was uneducated. How did she get away with doing the kinds of things she did in her life? As you might imagine, a number of people had observations regarding that question. I never had a chance to actually get in a word edgewise because so many other people had their thoughts about that. Today I'm going to offer, in a sense, an answer to that question, but I'm not going to talk just about Harriet Tubman. I'm going to talk about three different remarkable women, and with a focus on a rather remarkable woman from Southeast Alaska. So, first thing, I do want to weigh my words with care. I did this in writing our book, which you see in the slide. And I want to say right off the bat, please forgive me for any kind of thing that I say, any suggestion I make in characterizing individuals in this talk that might be impolite or a slight, given the traditions of this region. What I hope to do is what I hope that I achieved in this book. And to quote the words that I quote also in the book of the author and filmmaker Min Ting Ming Ha, I want to speak nearby, but not speaking about. That's a very important distinction. And she goes on to say, talking close to the subject without seizing or claiming the subject. This subject is really a subject for here. It's a subject for all of you. And it's a subject I hope that maybe some of you, either here in the audience today or those of you who are connected with us at other locations through YouTube Live, I hope you might also pursue this with your own insights and your own detective work. All right, so for starters, let me give you a quote that I think will be helpful as we go along today. This is a quote from our poet laureate. You may recognize her, Harjo. A story matrix connects all of us, and the story begins exactly where it's supposed to begin. We can't skip any part. So what I'm going to do today is pursue a story matrix. And the story matrix will involve these three women, Harriet Tubman, Mary Ramabai, and Frances H. Willard, and how their stories intersect at a particularly critical point, and how their stories both show commonalities and perhaps suggest how their chance meeting in Auburn, New York may have had an impact on their further careers. Okay, where does the story begin? Okay, the story begins with a passage I found in the final edition of Sarah Hopkins Bradford's book, Harriet, the Modern Moses. That particular little paragraph was, Pandita Ramabai went about that time to see Harriet Tubman, and they had an interesting talk together. Here was a remarkable trio, a trio? Taking hold of hands, the woman from East India, the Indian girl from the far west, and the black woman from the southern states, only two removes from an African savage. Okay, we're going to talk about objectification, and we're going to talk about condescension along the way in the course of this talk. But we'll leave that for the moment. So this was something I had never heard about that was thrown into the 1901 version of the book, meeting up with Pandita Ramabai and with an Indian girl from the far west. Well, how could I get further information about this famed meeting? And in fact, Pandita Ramabai wrote to her daughter about it because she was so impressed with meeting Harriet Tubman. And what she says is, I met her, she's growing old now, I liked her very much for what she did and what she's still doing for her own people. She goes on and talks at great length about Harriet Tubman's story as Harriet told it herself. And she even talks about orphan children and elderly who were living at her home because they couldn't take care of themselves. And then she finally concludes in the letter, Harriet is very large and strong. She hugged me like a bear and shook me by the hand until my poor little hand ached. But it was so nice to see such a person. Okay, that gave us a little bit more indication about what was going on. But what about that Indian girl from the far west? Well, it so happened that if you read not down the text, but read backward a little bit, you found in a previous paragraph during this, in this particular section of the 1901 edition, she says, I must not forget to mention the Indian girls of the Fort Wrangell School, who, having read a little notice of Harriet in the Evangelist, set to work and by their daily labor raised $37, which they sent me for Harriet. So, Fort Wrangell School. I didn't know where Fort Wrangell was. So that was going to take a little more detective work. And of course, I found out quite quickly with a quick look at Google. The Fort Wrangell School was here in southeast Alaska. And then when I began to look at the Fort Wrangell School, around the period of time that Mary Ramabai was talking about, who did I come up with but a lead in the person of somebody you may have heard of if you've studied the history of the missions in Alaska, the famed Mrs. Amanda Reed, or A.R. McFarland. It turned out, after I did a bit more research, trying to see where this could all converge, by looking up Amanda Reed McFarland and just searching around in newspapers around the time I was interested in, I find a bunch of references all of a sudden in around 1885. But they're all about an Indian girl. This is rather remarkable to me. Let's see. I've left a few of them out. I could give you some of the quotes here, I think, but let me see if I can find my other notes. But it was really basically one reference after another to an Indian girl or an Indian maiden. That was it. No indication of her name, no indication of any other really identification except that she was presumably associated with Amanda McFarland, who now was on a one-year leave from the mission in Sitka at that particular point in time, and who was raising money for the mission effort in Southeast Alaska, and doing so with this quote-unquote little Indian girl. So what do we learn about, do we learn anything more from all of these references? Because they did a tour in 1885 of at least, based on the number of newspapers I could find, at least 10 or 20 different cities, all over the eastern part of the United States. Well, we find out that she sang in her own language, "Jesus, lover of my soul." She also read portions of scripture in English and in her own language, which we'll find out very soon was Tlingit. We also find out that she did the same thing in another location. So, if you think about this, and if you do the math essentially, why is it that we only hear about a little Indian girl? Is it that all of the newspapers couldn't be troubled either with her casual name or her Indian name or whatever name she was going by? Could it possibly be that Amanda McFarland, in making her own case for the missions and really recounting her own life, did she just not get around to wanting to talk about this little Indian girl, but definitely wanted to show her, if you pardon the expression, show her off? And so she says, well, here is an Indian girl from the mission. She's going to sing a hymn for you in her own language, and she's going to read you some scriptures. And she even accompanies herself on the organ or piano, depending on what keyboard is available. I'm a bit suspicious about that. I don't think it was a coincidence that we don't get the name of this young woman in that year. However, the next year, we find that she begins to shape an identity, albeit somewhat limited. All of a sudden, we've got two different names for her. We have Fanny Willard, an Indian from Alaska, a pretty little girl. But we also get what must have been her traditional name, which in this particular version was quoted as a Shikshani. All right. And we learn a little bit more about her, but again, we have to read through the condescension of the writers of these articles. She has come to this country for the purpose of education. That's good information. Intending, after a course of instruction, to return to her own country to engage in mission work to uplift her own race. Such a common expression used in the 19th century when we are talking about people of color. Uplift, obviously people that need that kind of uplift. Mrs. McFarland presented a very impressive object lesson in the person of an Indian girl. An object lesson? An object lesson? Again, this seems to me to reek of objectification. And finally, Fanny Willard was 6 years ago a heathen who didn't know a word of English. So all of these indicators both praised her for her achievements and ability to play piano, ability to recite scriptures in English and Tlingit, but also suggested that's amazing in that it's coming from somebody who was a heathen, somebody from a people who needed uplift. Now we do get a few more clues that I can go through rather quickly. We hear about her getting ready to leave where she went to school in New Jersey for about 5 years. We hear about her making a few more mission-related meetings before she finally leaves, talking about her future and how she hopes to engage in uplift. And also she sings duets, including a duet with another missionary, I believe a European person of European origin who's going to join her in Sitka. Okay. Then once we get to Alaska, she's begun her work in 1890. Again, we get suggestions of a bit of condescension or prejudice. Even in the North Star newspaper, edited by Sheldon Jackson, she has acquired, quote, education and culture from 5 years of schooling. Again, she's there to help elevate her pupils. And then this rather cryptic reference, it is essential now that she's here that she must learn the art of housekeeping to be fully equipped for missionary work. We also learn again about her name, original name, Shakshani, and how Fanny was the name given to her by her mother when she was, I will put this in quotes, entrusted to Amanda McFarland to be brought up as Amanda McFarland's own child. We also hear that she's getting good reviews from all of the people in the mission, and she even keeps the house in excellent order and condition of cleanliness. In particular, she gets along very well with the students. So that's what we hear about her, but we do begin to hear echoes of Frances McFarland, or Frances Willard herself. Let's see, in the, I believe it's the, the Home Mission Monthly, what was it, of 1891. Let me see if I can find that quote for you. In the Home Mission Monthly of 1891, this is not long after she's arrived, maybe a year or so later, she says, my work so far has been perfect enjoyment. While I take pleasure in my work and make it a subject of constant prayer, there have been times where the sense of my total inexperience have almost driven away my other senses and the little self-reliance that I have. And I've almost despaired of ever doing any good. You must think that maybe I've been here too short a time. I think so too. At other times, I'm encouraged to go on, place my troubles in higher hands, and certainly He will reward my honest efforts. In another issue of the North Star, she relates a legend involving the White Raven and Ganuk. Some of you may know that lesson. In the interest of being a good guest here, I will not relate that particular story myself. She also, let's see, what else? She speaks of a home visit to a local member of the congregation, not a student, but a member of the congregation during vacations, during her vacation. And she says to the fellow, who is much older than she is, when she goes into his traditional house, she says, you know what? You ought to be able to build a house just like a good Boston house, actually, just like that chicken house in back of Reverend Warren's house. And she says, because actually this is a difficult situation for me coming to pay you a visit, she says, when I have to duck down very low and I'm always bumping my head against your, against your door frame. And then when I sit for a while and I forget myself, I stand up and I almost break through your roof. Anyway, that's what she says. And the gentleman says, well, I'll have to think about that. A good Boston house would be very expensive. But on the other hand, it would be great to be just as important as Reverend Warren's chickens. So she's not sure if he got the message. She says, the seed seemed to fall on stony ground, but here we are to sow with an unceasing, unwearying hand. We trust the Lord for the harvest. Okay, she writes to, she actually transfers to Chilkat, and she, at that point, is engaged to someone you might be familiar with, also Reverend Edwin Marsden. But she breaks the engagement, and she explains the breaking of her engagement to Sheldon Jackson. She says, if I'd become Edward Marsden's wife, that would have been the end of my ambition to return to Alaska, not only as a teacher, but as a trained nurse. She went on to say, in asking Jackson for support to take a nursing course in the States, and I'm assuming she's doing this with a bit of self-aware irony, she says, did you ever hear of a Tlingit who've never begged? She said, I am not an exception, as you see. I beg you to help me do my studies. Finally, one other revealing bit about herself is in an article she wrote about another legend, again, a legend I'm not going to recount to you today, except involving bears, and bears dealing with several different challenges. A high mountain, a thicket of devil's club, and also a long, deep morass of a swamp, and finally a big, wide river. And she goes on, after she's told this story, and she says, I've always been sort of a fellow, I've always had a sort of fellow feeling from those bears. We daily meet with mountain, swamp, and difficulties. They start up as by magic, these difficulties, how they test the fiber of our faith in an all-ruling God. But nonetheless, rarely is the word discouraged. In the very face of our trials and our difficulties, we can only cry victory, for our side grows brighter. So, somebody who was very serious about what she hoped to achieve, and someone who continued to work past any challenges that she encountered. Now, as I've indicated to you, she wrote a number of times in a number of missionary-related publications about traditions and about traditional stories, and they were published. And I dare say there were several others that escaped my notice. But the other remarkable thing that she published, or was published just after her death, was the first Tlingit grammar. She did this in association with help from Mrs. Tilly Paul, who she identifies as her cousin, and I dare say her role model if you know the career of Mrs. Paul. And also William D. Kelly, Grammar and Vocabulary of Tlingit Language in Southeast Alaska, 1904. And if you note here in the slide, you will see Jesus, lover, love of my soul, as she would have sung it, I'm sure, in her early activities as a fundraiser. Okay, what happens? A long and productive life is denied her. She gets tuberculosis. It is so bad she actually goes for a rest cure in the States, first to Tucson, Arizona, and then to Saranac Lake over one winter, accompanied by her foster mother, Mrs. McFarland. But the cure doesn't seem to be helping her. She says, I want to go back and be of service as long as I can. She goes back to Wrangell, where she came from originally, and she is able to help a bit longer, and then she is so sick, she is transferred to Sitka in the hospital that she had worked in as a hospital matron only a year or two before. Okay, she dies in December of 1904. Okay. Mrs. Willard in a nutshell, she's born in 1973, according to her own account, as the census taker for Sitka in 1900. Perhaps likely as her name was Shakshani, she may or may not have been conveyed or entrusted to Mrs. McFarland by her mother who'd also given her the name Fanny. She's adopted in any event by Mrs. McFarland, learns to play the piano, learns singing hymns, playing the organ, becomes very proficient in the English language, and then is being selected for education in the States and for eventual missionary work. And so she goes to the States then in that period between 1885 and 1890, going to a boarding school and being supported by, lo and behold, one of two sisters who were quite rich and quite supportive of the Presbyterian missions. And their names, one was Georgiana, the other was Caroline Willard. Now, some people thought that she adopted the name of Willard because of Carrie Willard, the missionary here, but another account tells us she was named Willard for a Miss Willard in Auburn, the very place where she was likely to have met Harriet Tubman. Okay, she works then in Sitka for a number of years, then moves on to Chillicote, and then gets the opportunity to do the nursing school, comes back to Sitka where she is hospital matron and scholarship correspondent until she falls ill, goes to the States in the winter of 2004-2005, and then comes back, dying later in 2005. Okay, going back then to the remarkable trio then, can you imagine what they must have talked about? These three rather remarkable women. That's what I want to try to deal with. I want to deal with briefly. And first I want to talk about some of the various experiences that they might have shared based on their biographies. Then I want to talk about then what would have been the things they might have connected about, and then how might that connection have had an impact on their future lives individually. Okay, Harriet Tubman, exploited as a child, put to work at an early age, and overcame enslavement by self-liberation and helped others to do the same in the Underground Railroad. Service to her country during the Civil War as a scout and as a nurse. She took in orphans and old people. We have that from the account. Already at this particular point, the three would have met. She was taking in orphans and old people into her home, and then was a very devout individual and knew her Bible and her hymnal back and forth. Okay, now what about this Mary Ramabai, who I've kind of left out of the equation? She's an interesting person in her own light. I'll just give you a quick background. She was born to a Brahmin family, and her father and brother gave talks on Sanskrit scholarship from town to town. And she learned to do the same thing, thus earning eventually the title Learned One, or Pandita or Pundita. When she's orphaned at 18, she lectures with her brother, and then he dies a few years later. And then she's married to an Indian who is not a Brahmin, but he dies 2 or 3 years later, and now she is in that situation. What happens when you're a widow? And a widow, when you're a widow, you're supposed to defer then to the family of your husband. And at that point, you're subjected to whatever it is they want you to do around the house, or you might be neglected also. And in her case, she said, no, I'm not going to do it. and she began organizing societies to try to help widows to be able to advance themselves and gain independence. That attracted the attention of the British, at that time, of course, running the show in India, and she is invited to spend some time in the United Kingdom. She eventually converts to Christianity, hence her name Mary Ramabai, even attempts to go into medical school, which doesn't work out, but she does begin to start raising money toward the benefit of widows in India. Then she actually makes her way then to the United States, where she also engages in fundraising for a school that she's going to have for these, a school that will enable Indian widows to gain all sorts of skills as teachers, nurses, et cetera, just the kinds of things that we've already heard about in terms of the mission activities in Alaska. Okay, Fanny Willard, we've talked about the fact that she was brought to the home of Amanda McFarland, at least in theory, adopted by Amanda McFarland and taught the 3 R's, instructed in religion and learned to play the keyboard and to sing hymns and recite scripture. She accompanied Mrs. McFarland on her fundraising tour, and at some point connected with one of the 2 Willard sisters and got the finances to be able to do her schooling in New Jersey. Also raising a little money on the way during that fundraising tour. She attended the girls' school then for her eventual career in Alaska. So imagine what these 3 women, given the convergences in their interests, given the convergences in their suffering, would have talked about. Being orphaned or being separated from their parents in childhood, being enslaved or exploited because of their race or because of their caste, finding a way to change that scenario through education and religion, and the importance of that religion in the form of scripture and the form of song. Caring for children and the elderly with schools and homes. All of these things, imagine them coming together and talking about this common experience they've had and this common challenge that they have overcome, so holding hands and singing spirituals. And imagine at least Mary Ramabai and Fanny Willard being given that wonderful bear hug by Harriet Tubman, who was, after all, the senior member of that trio. Now, that brings me to an interesting quote from Alexander Chee. He says, "It isn't that you fall in love with someone, you each allow yourself new identities with each other, new skins, almost like a cocoon to who you will become next." So, is it possible that these 3 women would have, in a sense, fallen in love with one another and through their interaction with each other began to form new cocoons that would carry them forward in their lives? Harriet, who had been taking in elderly and orphans, may be now being inspired by Pundita Ramabai to actually establishing a home, the Harriet Tubman home, which is what she will do later in life in 1903. Mary Ramabai, perhaps in the spirit of Harriet, would rescue outcast women and children during a famine in India. She was also, again, remember, interested in nursing and pursuing a medical career, and may have heard about what Harriet had done during the Civil War. Frances Willard, she may have been thinking about a medical credential in the spirit of her cousin, Tilly Paul. But definitely thinking about how she could make a difference for people of all ages and not just children. So, constructing an identity then, all three of them, and perhaps constructing the cocoon of a later identity they would hold. Writing about the essays of Chee, the model actress writer Emily Ratajkowski says, any of us constructs an identity across a lifetime, passively or actively. And all of these, as I've suggested in the title of my talk, in What's in a Name, all of the people I've spoken about today have forged an identity, in a sense, a series of identities, an evolving identity. So we have Harriet Tubman being born as Araminta Ross, being called Minty, including by the people that enslaved her, taking the name Harriet Tubman when she was married to John Tubman, and taking her mother's name as her first name when she was married. And then moving on also to Moses, her code name during the time of the Underground Railroad. Here's somebody who evolved from being an enslaved person to a humanitarian and a civil rights leader. Mary Rama, who took on various names along her life, the titles Pundita, another title involving scholarship, Saravasti, changing her identity and becoming a voice for the reform of women. And finally, that Indian girl, Shakshani, becoming Fanny McFarland while she was living at Sitka, and eventually Fanny Willard when she received her scholarship and afterwards, who became a speaker, a student, a teacher, a writer, and a nurse. So, with all of these women dealing with the kinds of prejudices they were going to encounter, first and foremost as women, but even in some ways even more importantly, I should say, in another dimension, as women of color in societies that were dominated in the 19th century age of imperialism and expansion. These women were able to forge a remarkable identity. Each of them found a name and a voice, and I might add here, in the case of Fanny Willard, a voice in her own language of Tlingit, even though, as all of you know far better than I, the language was suppressed during the missionary period and has been suppressed right up until a rather recent generation of people. And here she is singing her language, giving biblical verses in her language, and even putting together a grammar of her language. Okay, they found a voice, they found a vision, and that vision may well have been anchored in suffering, in neglect, and I might add, as you've noted in some of the quotes, condescension. So their story matrix both coped with the past, it incorporated their entire life experience, including their meeting, and eventually connects with all of us today as a story of people, again, with circumstances that were, diplomatically, I could express as adverse, and becoming people with vision, with an agenda, and with a desire to help other people. And that brings me to Joy Harjo again, actually. And this is a poem I just happened to read on the airplane, but it makes a nice bookend to the poem I gave you, the quote I gave you at the beginning of our story. This is called Without, and I will just give you the beginning of it. The world will keep trudging through time without us. When we lift from the story contest to fly home, we will be as falling stars to those watching from the edge of grief and heartbreak. maybe then we will see the design of the two-minded creature and know why half the world fights righteously for greedy masters, and the other half is nailing it all back together. I hope I've given you a bit of commentary to someone, and in fact 3 remarkable women who tried to nail it back together. So in doing this, this is the end of my odyssey, the end of my detective work, at least for the time being. Perhaps I hope that in the case of Fanny Willard in particular, but also for Harriet Tubman or Pandita Ramabai, this could be the beginning of your own path, or an important stopping point on your own path to find truth, to find significance, and to find stories that are worth telling again and again and again. And I would encourage you to take these things, and I'll be happy to give you the references, to take these stories and to carry them forward, document them, and most of all, to celebrate those shooting stars and what they accomplished in their lifetime. So, with that, my thanks to Sealaska, my thanks to the state libraries, and I think in the interest of any questions or comments, I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that excellent presentation. I'm just moderating the YouTube stream. I don't see any questions coming in online, but does anybody have any questions within the audience? I can run the mic out to you. Well, we have a couple of questions prepared. Here's one question. What are your thoughts on how both of these women are treated by the U.S. school system, or were treated by the U.S. school system? The quote-unquote, can you hear me?
By what system?
The U.S. schools, United States educational system. The quote-unquote Indian girl is largely ignored, and Harriet Tubman is often sanitized and sanctified. What would you like to see focused on in the classroom instead of these watered-down versions of history?
Well, one answer to that question, David, and to all of you, would be, again, more specifically, the answer I would have given to the person who said, how could Harriet Tubman make a difference in the world when she was a slave, she was brutalized, and never had any opportunities? Well, in one sense, the opportunities came through religion. The opportunities came from hearing Scripture, memorizing Scripture. The opportunities came from learning hymns and singing hymns, and that kind of background gave all of these women an extraordinary eloquence, an extraordinary sense of the world, and a deep-rooted philosophy. So, on the one hand, we don't want to underestimate the nature of natural education, the way that young people will develop, the way that young people will be able to pick up culture and be able to pick up anything. What do they say? Soak it in like a sponge. As far as the educational system, as I've suggested to you, even though officially the native languages were suppressed in the school system, in the case of Frances Willard, in spite of all of that, she forged ahead, always giving voice to her language in singing, in quoting Scripture, and in interacting, I'm sure, with her students. That didn't prevent her from saying, "Listen, you can learn English. I had to learn it. You can learn it as well." But she never gave up that language, and what's more, she even came up with the grammar so that more people could learn that language, and that the people who had not had the opportunity or had that language suppressed would have the opportunity to learn the language. Not to mention the fact that she herself recounted stories in the various publications.
Thanks.
Thanks. Hi, thank you so much for coming. I don't know if I have a question as much as a comment that I was hoping you'd be able to respond to. In comparing these three during your talk, what I noticed is that Harriet and Mary both had to deal with misogynistic hurdles more so than Mrs. Willard did. And it's interesting, the Sarah Bedford reference I've heard many times before, and her code name Moses is also a pretty misogynistic reference in that, you know, Harriet accomplished much more than Moses, and Moses had many more advantages. As in the, you know, story of Moses, he grew up in royalty, so he had plenty of education and privilege, whereas Harriet did not. So her hurdle is so much greater, and to continue to hear that reference to this day just, you know, bugs me. And what I want to point out is that Mrs. Willard came from a matriarchy, and so maybe her hurdle in misogyny was a lot lower because of the culture that she came from. And I'm just curious if you'd looked at that at all.
Yeah, in fact, one of the later articles written about Harriet Tubman, around 1900, 1904, something like that, the writer who is interviewing her, so all this information is coming not from the early biographies. They're coming, the stories are coming directly from her, and in fact, some of them vary a little bit from the original stories in the two books by Bradford. At one point, she says, because she also possessed some rather extraordinary abilities, including the ability to blend in, to disguise herself. Some people say she, in some ways, engaged in almost a physical transformation of herself when she wanted not to be seen, which would have been quite useful on the Underground Railroad. And I can certainly, from my point of view, see that as a possibility. If you will yourself to look different, and you're serious about it, and you believe you can do it, you will do it. The reason I mention this, and also the fact that she was not someone to be a shrinking violet, that she fought back and even in the Underground Railroad threatened some of the passengers, quote unquote, the other people who were self-liberating, who were getting cold feet. She would threaten them with a pistol and say, you either are going to make it across the line or you're going to be dead right here and now. But the author quotes her as saying that it was the ladies, the other ladies around, African American ladies that she grew up with, that said, you know what, you're one of those Ashanti women, meaning that she had that warrior disposition and she wasn't going to put up with anything. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. I see a question here in the YouTube chat. Mm-hmm. Are there further writings of Frances Willard? She had great sense of self-worth, just seeing her stance in the photo.
Yeah, and the answer to that is I really hope there is. I think I tried the best I could to comb the North Star, all the issues that I could find. But there are so many different missionary publications that we might be missing something. Also, I've noted only one letter to Sheldon Jackson. I'm guessing that if we start digging around, we can find more correspondence from her. So I think, you know, my acquaintance with Frances H. Willard is really a kind of a preliminary one, and I think if all of us were to work on documenting her, we would find even more of the real Frances Willard, and it would be extraordinary.
Thank you. Are there any other questions within the audience? Anybody have a burning question they want to like answered? Okay.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
In listening to your presentation, I noted that there was a different aspect that they could have been connecting on, and that was the aspect of colonialism. Not necessarily the religion piece. Religion was a piece that was introduced as a form of colonialism. So I wonder if their conversation could have been more around like liberation and not so much Christianity, as you pointed out.
I think that's a very useful comment, and you need to work with these veneers and gradually strip them away as best we can. What I will say to you is that we have the benefit of Harriet Tubman's long life, and we know that, and this will be only a partial answer to your question, it's not a complete answer, but at least I'll mention it to you, that in her later years, she was involved in the suffrage movement and was an active leader in that suffrage movement. That isn't exactly an anti-colonial movement, but yet it was something that did relate to her notions of human rights as she would frame them, at least in the US context. In terms of Pandita Ramabai, by creating these organizations, and by creating schools and opportunities for widows, for orphan children, she did, in a sense, strike out against the system the way it was, a system that was geared to generating famine because of taxes and all of that. So you could say that in some ways, both of those individuals kind of struck at the system, but kind of indirectly from the point of view of the vote and from the point of view of dealing with the colonial system and its specific abuses. Imagine what Fanny Willard would have done if she had lived as long as, say, say Harriet Tubman. If she'd lived into her 90s, I think she would have also been someone who would have been working very, very hard to change the system. Perhaps not in the way we would frame it, but certainly in the point of view of the way the system affected her and its abuses.
Thank you. Are you aware if the grammar developed by Mrs. Willard are you aware if the grammar, the Tlingit language grammar developed by Mrs. Willard is available today?
Yes, actually, you can look it up on Google, or rather books.google.com. And what you saw in my presentation was just a screenshot of the first page. It's interesting, the introduction, which I didn't get into, says that the purpose of that grammar was for officials, but also for students to be more proficient at their own language.
Thank you. Do you have one final question from the audience? Anybody?
Any final comments?
Or comments? All right, well, thank you very much for your presentation today and for your enlightening research, and I hope that you've inspired others to carry the work on and explore more about the lives of these three women.
Yeah, so let's make this the very beginning of a collaboration, and again, what I've had here I'll gladly share with you as we move forward to appreciate these women in their many dimensions. Thanks again.
Thank you. Our next lecture will be tomorrow, Wednesday, November 24th, and the lecture will only be available online via our YouTube channel. The lecture is titled Infectious Diseases, Settler Colonialism, and Race on Sitka Training School. It's presented by Adam Kirsch. Thank you for joining us today.